In 2003, scientists finished mapping the entire human genome and made a discovery that should have ended the conversation about race forever. Human beings, no matter where their ancestors came from, no matter what continent their families trace back to, are 99. 9% genetically identical. That number is almost impossible to wrap your head around. It means that whatever differences we see on the surface, skin color, hair texture, facial features, all of it comes from a sliver of our genetic code so small it barely registers on the scale of the whole genome. And yet, when researchers began comparing the DNA of Black Americans and white Americans, they uncovered patterns so strange, so tangled with history, that even geneticists were stunned by what they found. Think about that for a moment. Every war fought over racial hierarchy, every law written to separate people by skin color, every social system built on the idea that some groups are fundamentally different from others at a biological level, all of it stands on a foundation that modern genetics has quietly, completely dismantled. This is not a story about biological race, because biological race, in the way most people imagine it, does not exist. This is a story about something far more complicated. It is a story about ancestry, admixture, migration, and the long shadow of slavery, all written into the DNA of tens of millions of Americans, whether they know it or not. For most of American history, people believed race was something you could see, something fixed and biological, something written into the body itself. In the 19th century, doctors and scientists went to extraordinary lengths to prove this. They measured skulls, they compared facial angles, they cataloged bone structure, hoping to find some physical marker that would separate one race from another in a way that justified the social hierarchies of the time. One physician, a man named Samuel Cartwright, working in Louisiana in 1851, even invented a fictional disease to explain why enslaved people kept trying to escape captivity. He called it drapetomania, framing the basic human desire for freedom as a medical disorder unique to Black people. It sounds absurd today, and it is absurd, but it reveals something important. For centuries, science was not neutral. It was shaped by the assumptions of the people conducting it, and those assumptions were often used to justify slavery, segregation, and discrimination. Even into the 20th century, forensic scientists claimed they could identify a person's race just by examining their skeleton. This idea became deeply embedded in criminal investigations and popular culture alike. But when researchers went back decades later and rigorously tested these claims using skulls from known individuals, the results collapsed. In tests specifically designed to identify Native American skeletal remains, forensic classification was correct less often than random guessing would have been. 2 incorrect identifications for every correct one. The confident claims of earlier generations of scientists, claims that shaped courtrooms and textbooks, turned out to be little more than educated guesswork dressed up as objective fact. Human variation simply does not sort itself into the tidy biological boxes that race implies. It never did. And yet this myth persisted for so long precisely because it was useful. A society built on slavery and later on segregation needed a scientific justification to make that system feel natural, even inevitable. Scientists of the era were not operating in a vacuum. They were producing research that reinforced the economic and social order of their time, and that research was treated as objective truth for generations, taught in medical schools, cited in courtrooms, and absorbed into the popular imagination, long after any credible evidence supported it. So when the Human Genome Project was completed in 2003, it did something remarkable. It gave scientists an actual empirical answer to a question that had been debated, distorted, and weaponized for hundreds of years. And the answer was clear. There is no genetic basis for race. Humans are not divided into distinct biological populations that map them onto the categories we call Black, White, Asian, or Native American. Genetic variation exists, absolutely, but it does not cluster along the lines that societies have used to divide people. Most human genetic diversity actually exists within so-called racial groups, not between them. 2 people who are both classified as white can be more genetically different from each other than either one is from a person classified as Black. Race, as it turns out, is a real social force with very real consequences, but it is not a biological category written into our chromosomes. This is where the story gets more interesting, because if race is not biological, why do genetic studies of Black Americans and white Americans keep turning up such striking, sometimes confusing results? The answer lies not in race, but in ancestry, and the 2 are very different things. Ancestry refers to where your genetic material actually comes from, generation after generation, traced back through your family tree. Race is a label, a social category assigned based on appearance and social context. When scientists began using DNA testing to trace ancestry rather than assign race, they discovered a story that had been hidden in plain sight for centuries, a story shaped almost entirely by the history of slavery in the United States. Because of that history, the overwhelming majority of African Americans carry some percentage of European ancestry in their DNA. Estimates vary depending on the study and the population sampled, but most research puts the average somewhere between 17 and 25% European ancestry among African Americans today. Some individuals carry far more, some far less, and the number shifts significantly depending on geography. This admixture did not happen by accident or by mutual choice. It happened primarily through the sexual exploitation of enslaved black women by white slaveholders, overseers, and other men in positions of power during the era of American slavery. Genealogist and Harvard scholar Henry Louis Gates Jr. once noted that a striking percentage of African American men, roughly 35% by some estimates, can trace their lineage back to a white male ancestor who fathered a mixed-race child during the slavery era. That is not a footnote in history. That is a defining feature of American genetic history, written directly into the DNA of millions of families today. What makes this even more remarkable is what DNA testing revealed about the other side of that equation. For generations, many white Americans considered themselves to be entirely of European descent, with no ancestral connection to Africa whatsoever. But as consumer DNA testing became widely available, an unexpected pattern began to emerge. A significant number of people who identified as white, and whose families had identified as white for generations, carried detectable amounts of African ancestry in their genetic results. Researchers began calling this hidden ancestry, not because it was intentionally concealed, though in some cases it may have been, but because many of these individuals had no idea it existed until a DNA test told them otherwise. Some of these hidden genetic threads trace back to relationships and family lines that were deliberately obscured or reclassified over generations. As some mixed-race individuals in earlier centuries chose, or were forced by circumstance to identify as white in order to escape the brutal realities of racial discrimination in America. Their descendants, generations later, are only now discovering that history through a simple genetic test. Much of what we now know about this hidden ancestry has come from the explosion of consumer DNA testing over the past 2 decades. Companies built entirely around the promise of genetic ancestry testing turned what used to be a niche academic pursuit into something tens of millions of ordinary people could do from their own kitchen table, spitting into a small plastic tube and mailing it off for analysis. For many customers, the results were exactly what they expected. But for a significant number, the results rewrote their entire understanding of their family history. Genealogists working with these companies have described a recurring and emotionally complicated pattern. Individuals researching their family trees, often starting with nothing more than curiosity, would trace a genetic line back through history and discover an enslaved ancestor and a white slaveholder ancestor, connected within the same family, sometimes just a few generations apart. One genealogist described the experience of finding this pattern repeated over and over throughout a single family tree as something that produced a genuine emotional reaction, a mixture of sadness at the history being uncovered and a strange sense of clarity at finally understanding where certain unexplained family stories had come from. These are not abstract statistics. They are individual human stories, repeated across millions of American families, each one a small fragment of a much larger historical pattern that DNA testing has only recently made visible. And one of the more fascinating findings in this area of research involves internal migration within the United States itself. For most of American history, the black population in the United States was heavily concentrated in the South, a direct legacy of the plantation economy and slavery. But in the 20th century, millions of African Americans left the South during what historians call the Great Migration, moving to cities in the North, Midwest, and West in search of better economic opportunities and to escape the violence and legal discrimination of the Jim Crow South. When researchers compared the genetic ancestry of African Americans living in different regions of the country today, they found something unexpected. African Americans living outside the South tend, on average, to carry a higher percentage of European ancestry than those who remained in the South. At first glance, this seems like a strange coincidence, but researchers have proposed a deeply troubling explanation. Because lighter skin was often associated, however unjustly, with greater social and economic opportunity during that era, individuals with a higher proportion of European ancestry may have had comparatively better access to jobs, education, and resources that made migration possible in the first place. In other words, the genetic makeup of entire regions of the country today may partially reflect patterns of colorism and discrimination that shaped who was able to leave the South and who was not. It is a striking example of how social history does not just shape culture and economics. It can leave a measurable imprint on the genetic composition of populations, generations later. European ancestry is not the only unexpected thread woven into the genetic story of African Americans. Researchers analyzing large genetic data sets have also found that a meaningful percentage of individuals who identify as African American carry detectable Native American ancestry as well, often at least 1% or more, a legacy of contact, cohabitation, and sometimes shared displacement between Black and indigenous communities throughout American history. particularly in regions where enslaved people escaped and formed relationships with Native American communities, or where forced removal and slavery intersected in complicated and often painful ways. This layer of ancestry rarely gets the same attention as the European admixture story, but it adds yet another dimension to just how complex and interconnected American genetic history actually is. No single group story exists in isolation. Every population's DNA carries traces of the others it has come into contact with, sometimes through violence, sometimes through survival, and sometimes through relationships that history books never fully recorded. Beyond ancestry and admixture, there is another layer to this story that involves how the body itself responds to lived experience, and this is where the science becomes genuinely groundbreaking. Researchers studying something called epigenetics, which examines how genes are switched on or off through chemical modifications rather than changes to the underlying DNA sequence itself, have found consistent and troubling differences between Black and white Americans in a measurement known as biological aging. Using a technique that analyzes patterns of DNA methylation, scientists can estimate a person's biological age, which can differ significantly from their actual chronological age. Multiple studies have found that Black Americans, on average, show signs of accelerated biological aging compared to white Americans of the same chronological age. Researchers have a name for this phenomenon. They call it weathering, a term that describes the cumulative biological toll of chronic stress, systemic inequality, environmental exposure, and socioeconomic hardship on the human body over time. To understand why this matters, it helps to know a little about how DNA methylation actually works. Every cell in your body contains the same DNA, but not every gene is active in every cell, or active to the same degree at every point in your life. Small chemical tags, called methyl groups, attach to specific locations along your DNA strand, acting almost like switches that turn certain genes up or down without altering the underlying genetic code itself. As people age, these methylation patterns shift in fairly predictable ways, which is exactly why scientists can use them to estimate biological age with impressive accuracy. When researchers compared methylation patterns across thousands of genetic markers in middle-aged Black and white Americans, they found significantly more age-associated changes in Black participants, particularly in genes linked to age-related disease and to biological pathways involved in growth, development, and inflammation. This is not a genetic difference in the sense that people usually think about race and genetics. Nobody's arguing that Black Americans are biologically programmed to age faster. Instead, researchers are finding that environmental and social factors, things like exposure to air pollution, neighborhood deprivation, chronic stress from experiences of discrimination, and unequal access to quality health care, leave a measurable physical imprint on the body at the molecular level. One major study examining older Americans found that neighborhood conditions, including exposure to fine particulate air pollution and overall neighborhood deprivation, contributed significantly to the gap in biological aging between Black and white participants, even after accounting for individual socioeconomic status. In other words, where you live and the compounding effects of systemic inequality in that environment can quite literally change how your DNA behaves, accelerating the biological processes associated with aging and, by extension, age-related disease. Similar patterns show up when researchers examine cardiovascular health. Multiple studies have found that Black Americans experience a disproportionately high burden of cardiovascular disease compared to white Americans, and some of that disparity appears to be connected to measurable differences in vascular function. Research using specialized tonometry devices to measure arterial stiffness and microvascular function found that Black participants showed reduced reactive hyperemia index scores and greater arterial wave reflection compared to white participants, both of which are associated with cardiovascular risk. Once again, the explanation is not some hidden difference buried in ancient ancestral DNA. It reflects the compounding effects of chronic stress, unequal healthcare access, systemic bias within medical institutions, and social determinants of health that disproportionately affect Black communities in the United States. The body keeps a record, and for many Black Americans, that record reflects generations of structural inequality rather than any inherent biological distinction between races. There is also a more subtle, more institutional layer to this story that scientists have only recently begun to fully reckon with, and it involves the genetic databases researchers rely on to conduct their studies in the first place. For decades, the vast majority of genetic research was conducted using DNA samples from people of European descent. This created what scientists now openly acknowledge as a massive blind spot in medical genetics. When researchers build reference genomes and conduct large-scale genetic studies, known as genome-wide association studies, using data drawn overwhelmingly from European populations, they end up with tools that work remarkably well for people of European ancestry and considerably less well for everyone else. This is not a hypothetical problem. It has real consequences for real people today. When a Black American undergoes genetic testing for an inherited disease risk, the results are more likely to come back as what geneticists call a variant of uncertain significance, meaning the test detected a genetic variation, but scientists simply do not have enough reference data from people of similar ancestry to know whether that variation is harmless or dangerous. This happens far less often for people of European descent, because the databases are so much richer and more thoroughly studied for that population. The result is a genuine disparity in the quality and usefulness of genetic medicine, one that has nothing to do with biological differences in DNA and everything to do with decades of who was included and who was left out of genetic research. It is impossible to talk honestly about medical distrust in Black communities without acknowledging the specific historical events that produced it. For 4 decades, starting in the 1930s, the United States Public Health Service conducted a study on hundreds of Black men in Alabama, allowing them to suffer through untreated syphilis, even after effective treatment became widely available, all without their informed consent, simply to observe how the disease progressed. That study alone did not create medical mistrust out of nothing. It confirmed, in the most brutal way possible, suspicions that many Black communities already held about how the American medical establishment viewed their lives and their bodies. Layer on top of that, decades of unequal access to health care, documented bias in pain treatment, and continued underrepresentation in clinical research, and the resulting skepticism toward genetic testing in medical science becomes not just understandable, but predictable. Surveys examining how Black and white Americans perceive genetic testing in medical research have consistently found that Black Americans report significantly lower trust in medical providers and scientific literature compared to white Americans. Given the well-documented history of unethical medical experimentation on Black Americans throughout the 20th century, along with the ongoing underrepresentation of Black participants in genetic research today, that skepticism is not irrational. It is a rational response to a long pattern of exploitation and neglect within American medicine and science. Rebuilding that trust, researchers argue, requires more than just recruiting more diverse participants into studies. It requires transparency, community engagement, and a genuine reckoning with the historical reasons that distrust exists in the first place. Perhaps the most striking recent development in this entire field comes from a massive federal research initiative called the All of Us Research Program, run by the National Institutes of Health, which has been working to sequence and analyze genetic data from 1 million participants across the United States, deliberately prioritizing participants from historically underrepresented backgrounds. When researchers examined the results, they confirmed something geneticists have argued for years, but rarely had this much data to demonstrate so clearly. Self-identified race and ethnicity often do not line up cleanly with a person's actual genetic ancestry. People who identify with the same racial category can show remarkably different patterns of genetic ancestry, while people from different racial categories can sometimes show genetic ancestry that overlaps significantly. This reinforces a point that geneticists have been making for decades, one that is finally beginning to reshape how medical research is conducted. Ancestry, the actual genetic lineage traced through DNA, is a far more precise and useful tool for understanding health disparities and disease risk than race, a social category that was never designed to reflect biology in the first place. Increasingly, researchers are shifting away from broad racial categories in genetic studies and toward more precise measures of genetic ancestry, a change that could meaningfully improve the accuracy and fairness of personalized medicine in the years ahead. This gap in representation has consequences that extend well beyond ancestry testing and into everyday medicine. Pharmacogenomics, the branch of medicine that studies how genetic variation affects a person's response to specific drugs, is becoming an increasingly important part of modern healthcare, guiding decisions about drug dosing and predicting who is likely to experience side effects. But because the vast majority of pharmacogenomic research has historically been conducted using European ancestry populations, doctors and researchers often have far less reliable data about how certain medications interact with genetic variants more common in people of African, indigenous, or other underrepresented ancestries. This means that as personalized medicine becomes more advanced and more central to healthcare, the benefits of that progress risk being distributed unevenly, deepening rather than closing existing health disparities, unless researchers make a deliberate and sustained effort to build more representative genetic databases moving forward. Programs like All of Us represent a direct response to this problem, an attempt to correct decades of imbalance by intentionally recruiting a genetic data set that actually reflects the full diversity of the American population, rather than one skewed overwhelmingly toward a single ancestral group. So what does all of this actually mean when you step back and look at the full picture? It means that when scientists compare the DNA of Black Americans and white Americans, they are not uncovering evidence of separate biological races, because that concept simply does not hold up under genetic scrutiny. What they are uncovering instead is something arguably more powerful and more revealing: They are uncovering a genetic record of American history itself, written into the chromosomes of tens of millions of people. It is a record of forced migration and slavery. It is a record of exploitation and hidden family lines stretching back centuries. It is a record of internal migration shaped by colorism and unequal opportunity. And it is a record of ongoing structural inequality, showing up not as some ancient biological code, but as measurable changes in how genes are expressed and how bodies age, shaped by the environments people are forced to live in today. It is worth pausing here to address a question that probably occurred to you somewhere along the way. If race is not biological, why do ancestry testing companies still sell products that seem to sort your DNA into regional and even racial categories? The answer is that these companies are not actually detecting race. They are detecting patterns of genetic similarity to reference populations from specific geographic regions, built by comparing your DNA to samples collected from people whose families have lived in particular parts of the world for many generations. A result that says a certain percentage of your ancestry traces to West Africa or Northern Europe is a statement about geography and population history, not a scientific confirmation of racial identity. The categories on the results page are simplified for a general audience, but underneath that simplified presentation is the same complex, continuous picture of human genetic variation that researchers have been documenting for decades. Understanding that distinction helps make sense of why two people who both identify as black or both identify as white can receive strikingly different ancestry breakdowns. Because ancestry, unlike race, was never meant to sort neatly into a handful of fixed boxes in the first place. None of this makes the differences researchers find any less real or any less important. Weathering is real. Disparities in cardiovascular health are real. The gap in genetic testing accuracy between different populations is real, but the explanation for all of it is not hidden somewhere deep in ancient ancestral DNA, waiting to be discovered. The explanation is history, and the ongoing present-day consequences of that history, written into biology through the very real mechanisms of chronic stress, environmental exposure, unequal healthcare, and centuries of forced and coerced admixture between populations. Understanding this distinction matters enormously because, for too long, observed differences between racial groups were used to justify claims of inherent biological inferiority or difference. The actual science tells a very different story. It tells us that the differences we see are not proof that race is biologically real. They are proof of exactly the opposite, proof of just how deeply social history, injustice, and inequality can shape the biology of human beings, generation after generation, without ever touching the fundamental genetic unity that connects every single person on this planet. We remain, all of us, 99. 9% the same. What separates us was never written in our genes to begin with. It was written by us, in the choices, laws, and systems we built. And in many cases, it is a history we are only now beginning to fully read. Every strand of DNA carried by every person alive today is, in its own quiet way, a witness. It has traveled through centuries of migration, survival, coercion, and resilience to arrive in the body of someone reading these words or hearing this story right now. The science does not ask us to ignore the differences that show up between groups of people. It asks us to understand them correctly, to trace them back to their actual origins in history and environment, rather than inventing a biological explanation that was never there to begin with. That, in the end, is what makes this field of research so powerful. It does not just tell us about our genes, it tells us, with remarkable precision, who we really are.